March 17, 1944, 0630 hours. Kume-jima Island, southern Ryukyu Chain. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Yamada pressed the field telephone receiver against his ear, straining to hear through the static crackling across the island's communication network. From his observation post, carved into the volcanic cliffs of the eastern shore, he had maintained visual contact with the American fleet since dawn, counting vessels, estimating strength, preparing his final report to garrison headquarters. The mathematics seemed straightforward. 12 destroyers, 6 cruisers, 2 battleships, and what appeared to be 37 transport vessels arranged in precise formation 3 miles offshore. All eyes fixed on Shirahama Beach, the island's primary landing zone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Confirmed sighting, American task force bearing 090 degrees, estimated strength battalion plus. Yamada spoke into the handset, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. Through his Zeiss binoculars, acquired during happier days of German-Japanese cooperation, he watched landing craft being lowered from their motherships in orderly sequence. Everything proceeded exactly as the garrison's intelligence officers had predicted for 18 months. The Americans would strike at Shirahama, where the reef was lowest, where the approach offered the clearest run to shore, where Japanese defensive preparations had reached near perfection. Yet something felt wrong. Yamada had served in amphibious operations during the Shanghai campaign of 1937, had studied every major seaborne assault from Gallipoli to Dieppe. Naval commanders didn't typically announce their intentions so clearly, positioning their entire fleet in full view of enemy observers hours before an assault. American doctrine, as understood by Imperial headquarters, emphasized speed and surprise. This deliberate, almost ceremonial deployment contradicted everything Japanese intelligence had learned about enemy tactics. "The dragon shows all his teeth," whispered Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, Yamada's spotter, using an old saying from their home prefecture. "Either he is very confident, or he wants us to see them." The sergeant had been on Kume-jima since its fortification began, had helped position every gun emplacement, every bunker, every meter of barbed wire that now defended the island's approaches. If anyone understood the defensive layout, it was Nakamura. The confidence radiating from Japanese defensive positions across Kume-jima that morning was not misplaced optimism, but the result of meticulous planning that had transformed a sleepy fishing island into one of the most formidable fortress positions in the Central Pacific. Colonel Takeshi Ishida, commanding the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, had arrived on Kume-jima in August 1943 with explicit orders from Imperial General Headquarters to create an impregnable bastion that would halt American advance toward the home islands for at least 6 months, buying precious time for Japan's final defensive preparations. Ishida was no ordinary garrison commander. A graduate of the Imperial War College's Advanced Fortification course, he had served as an observer during the German siege of Sevastopol, witnessing firsthand how properly constructed defensive positions could withstand overwhelming enemy superiority. Upon arriving at Kume-jima, he immediately recognized that the island's unique geography offered exceptional defensive advantages, provided those advantages were properly exploited. The island measured roughly 4 miles long and 2 miles wide, with 3 potential landing beaches separated by imposing cliff formations that rose nearly 300 feet above sea level. Shirahama Beach, the largest and most obvious landing zone, occupied the island's northeastern coast. Here, a semicircular bay provided relatively calm waters and a gently sloping approach that seemed to invite amphibious assault. Japanese engineers had spent 14 months transforming this apparent vulnerability into a killing zone of unprecedented sophistication. The beach itself was mined with over 2,000 individual explosive devices, each carefully positioned to detonate when landing craft approached specific grid coordinates. Behind the sand, a complex system of interlocking bunkers provided overlapping fields of fire, while mortar positions registered on predetermined target zones ensured that any successful landing would face immediate and accurate artillery response. The second potential landing area, designated Kuronami Beach by the garrison, lay along the island's western shore. Smaller than Shirahama, but equally accessible, this rocky cove had been identified by Japanese planners as a possible secondary landing site that Americans might use to divide defensive attention. Ishida positioned the 2nd Battalion of his mixed brigade here, along with mobile reserves that could reinforce either Shirahama or respond to diversionary attacks elsewhere on the island. The western approaches were heavily mined, and camouflaged gun positions commanded every possible avenue of approach from the sea. The third beach, known locally as Minamihama, occupied a narrow strip of the southern coast. This location seemed least likely to attract enemy attention, as the approaches required navigating through treacherous coral formations, and the beach itself was barely wide enough to accommodate a company-sized landing. Nevertheless, Ishida's thoroughness demanded that even this remote possibility be defended. A reinforced company from the 3rd Battalion maintained positions here more as observers than serious defensive forces, with instructions to delay any landing long enough for mobile reserves to respond from the island's interior. Japanese defensive doctrine in 1944 had evolved significantly from the early war period when commanders had attempted to stop enemy forces at the water's edge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means lessons learned from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Gilbert Islands had demonstrated that trying to prevent initial landings against overwhelming American firepower often resulted in the destruction of forward defensive positions before they could inflict meaningful casualties. The new approach, refined through bitter experience across the Pacific, emphasized defense in depth, with forward positions designed to channel enemy forces into predetermined killing zones where prepared defensive positions could exact maximum casualties. Colonel Ishida had embraced this doctrine enthusiastically, but with his own tactical refinements based on Kume-jima's specific terrain advantages. Rather than simply creating defensive zones behind each potential landing beach, he had designed an integrated defensive system that assumed the Americans would land at Shirahama, the most obvious target, and had prepared to destroy them there through concentrated firepower from positions they could not effectively suppress with naval bombardment. The key to this strategy was maintaining absolute fire discipline until American forces had committed themselves completely to the Shirahama assault. Intelligence assessments supported this approach with reassuring consistency. American Amphibious doctrine, as analyzed by Imperial Navy staff officers, emphasized overwhelming force applied at a single decisive point. The Americans preferred to concentrate their landing forces rather than disperse them across multiple objectives, reasoning that a successful penetration at one point could be exploited to roll up defensive positions elsewhere. This tactical preference played directly into Japanese defensive strengths, allowing commanders like Ishida to concentrate their limited forces rather than spreading them thin across multiple possible landing sites. The garrison's intelligence picture of American capabilities had been assembled from multiple sources over the preceding months. Aerial reconnaissance flights, though increasingly rare due to American air superiority, had provided detailed photographs of American fleet compositions and landing craft configurations. Radio intercepts, painstakingly decoded by Navy cryptographic specialists, had revealed American preference for dawn assaults following intensive naval bombardment. Most importantly, interrogations of prisoners captured during earlier island battles had confirmed American tactical doctrine emphasizing rapid seizure of airfield facilities, which, on Kume-jima, meant the partially completed airstrip located directly inland from Shirahama Beach. Everything pointed toward a single, massive assault against Shirahama, exactly the scenario for which Ishida had prepared most thoroughly. The colonel had personally walked every meter of defensive terrain, adjusting fields of fire, repositioning weapons, refining coordination between different defensive sectors. He knew precisely how long American forces would require to cross the beach, had calculated the optimal moment to commence firing, had rehearsed communication procedures that would coordinate the defensive response down to individual squad level. The psychological preparation of his garrison had been equally thorough. Ishida understood that soldiers fought most effectively when they believe absolutely in their mission and their chances of success. Throughout the winter of 1943 to 1944, he had conducted regular briefings explaining exactly how the defensive plan would unfold, how American tactical limitations would work in Japan's favor, how the terrain advantages of Kume-jima made enemy success virtually impossible. These sessions had created remarkable confidence throughout the garrison, from senior battalion commanders down to individual riflemen manning forward observation posts. Lieutenant Commander Yamada, observing the American fleet deployment through his binoculars that March morning, represented the collective confidence of nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and conscripted laborers who had transformed Kume-jima into what they genuinely believed was an impregnable fortress. Every man in the garrison knew his specific role in the defensive plan. Every weapon had been positioned for maximum effectiveness. Every possible contingency had been analyzed and prepared for. The only remaining question was when the Americans would commence their inevitable assault against Shirahama Beach. The island's defensive preparations extended far beyond simple military positions. Japanese engineers had spent months studying American landing techniques, analyzing how enemy forces approached defended beaches, identifying the specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the critical moments when troops transitioned from landing craft to shore positions. Beach obstacles had been positioned not randomly, but according to precise calculations designed to channel landing craft into predetermined lanes where concealed anti-tank guns could engage them most effectively. Underwater mines were placed not merely to sink approaching vessels, but to force them into specific approach routes where Japanese artillery could achieve concentrated fire. Communication systems linking all defensive positions had been buried underground and protected against naval bombardment, ensuring that Colonel Ishida could coordinate the defensive response even if surface installations were destroyed. Ammunition supplies had been distributed across multiple concealed bunkers, each positioned to supply specific defensive sectors throughout an extended battle. Medical facilities had been prepared in deep caves, protected against enemy fire while remaining accessible to wounded defenders. Even food and water supplies had been calculated to sustain the garrison through a siege lasting up to 3 months. The confidence radiating from these preparations was infectious. Veteran NCOs who had survived earlier island battles spoke with genuine conviction about Kume-jima's defensive advantages. Even recent conscripts, many of whom had arrived on the island with understandable apprehension about facing American amphibious assault, had been convinced by the evident thoroughness of the defensive preparations. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. American forces landing at Shirahama would face concentrated fire from positions they could not effectively suppress, would have to cross mined beaches under continuous artillery bombardment, would find themselves trapped between the sea and defensive positions that had been designed specifically to repel exactly this type of assault. As morning sunlight illuminated the American fleet offshore, Japanese observers throughout the garrison settled into their final preparations with the calm confidence of soldiers who knew exactly what was coming and had prepared accordingly. Radio operators checked their equipment one final time. Artillery crews made final adjustments to weapons that had been precisely registered on target zones months earlier. Machine gunners ensured their fields of fire remained clear of any obstacles that might have appeared overnight. Everything was ready. The only remaining task was to wait for the Americans to begin their predictable assault against the most obvious target, Shirahama Beach, where Colonel Ishida's carefully prepared defensive system would demonstrate once again that properly fortified positions could defeat any amphibious assault, regardless of enemy numerical or material superiority. The supreme confidence of that March morning would soon be tested in ways that neither Colonel Ishida nor any member of his garrison could possibly have anticipated. What Colonel Ishida and his meticulously prepared garrison did not know was that 300 miles southeast of Kume-jima, in the cramped operations room of the USS Intrepid, American planners had been developing an entirely different approach to Pacific amphibious warfare. The revolution in tactical thinking had begun not with grand strategic pronouncements from Washington, but with the careful observations of a relatively junior intelligence officer named Captain Robert Chen, whose analysis of Japanese defensive patterns had identified a critical vulnerability in imperial fortress strategy. Chen had spent 18 months studying captured Japanese defensive plans from across the Pacific, interviewing prisoners, analyzing aerial photographs, and most importantly, walking the beaches of recently captured islands to understand exactly how Japanese commanders thought about amphibious defense. His conclusions, initially dismissed by senior planners as overly complicated, would fundamentally change how American forces approached heavily defended island positions. The breakthrough insight had come during Chen's examination of Beidio's captured defensive plans in December 1943. Japanese commanders, he realized, were not simply building random fortifications. They were creating integrated defensive systems based on absolutely predictable assumptions about how American amphibious assaults would unfold. Every Japanese fortress followed the same logical pattern, concentrating maximum defensive firepower at the most obvious landing site while treating secondary beaches as diversionary threats requiring only token resistance. This predictability, Chen argued in his report to Admiral Mark Mitcher, represented a strategic opportunity of unprecedented magnitude. If American forces could abandon their own predictable assault patterns, if they could attack multiple beaches simultaneously with equal strength rather than concentrating overwhelming force at a single point, they could render Japanese defensive preparations largely irrelevant. The concept was tactically radical and logistically nightmarish, but Chen's mathematical analysis suggested it could reduce American casualties by as much as 60% while dramatically shortening the time required to secure defended islands. Admiral Mitcher, commanding Task Force 38, had initially been skeptical of Chen's proposal. American amphibious doctrine emphasized concentration of force for excellent reasons. Dividing assault forces across multiple landing sites risked defeat in detail, complicated command and control, and diluted the overwhelming firepower advantage that had made earlier Pacific victories possible. Traditional military wisdom, confirmed by successful operations from Guadalcanal through the Marshalls, suggested that splitting attacking forces was the surest path to tactical disaster. However, Chen's intelligence analysis contained one compelling argument that overcame these doctrinal objections. Japanese defensive positions, no matter how thoroughly prepared, were fundamentally static. Once committed to defending specific beaches with predetermined fire plans and fixed defensive positions, Japanese commanders lacked the mobility and communication systems necessary to rapidly redeploy forces between different sectors of their islands. If American forces could achieve tactical surprise by attacking where Japanese defenses were weakest, they could establish multiple footholds before enemy commanders could coordinate effective counterattacks. The tactical concept that emerged from these discussions was deceptively simple in theory but extraordinarily complex in execution. Rather than the traditional approach of overwhelming the strongest Japanese positions, American forces would simultaneously assault multiple beaches with roughly equal strength, forcing Japanese commanders to fight separate battles with forces positioned and equipped for entirely different defensive scenarios. The primary assault would indeed target the most obvious landing site, but only as one element of a coordinated attack designed to prevent Japanese forces from concentrating their defensive firepower. Implementing this concept required solving logistical challenges that had never been attempted in Pacific warfare. Traditional amphibious assaults concentrated all available landing craft, naval gunfire support, and air cover at a single beach, overwhelming Japanese defenses through sheer material superiority. A simultaneous three-beach assault required dividing these assets while maintaining sufficient strength at each landing site to achieve tactical success. Every element of the amphibious system, from landing craft allocation to artillery coordination, had to be redesigned from fundamental principles. The naval gunfire support plan alone required months of detailed calculation. Japanese defensive positions had been surveyed through aerial reconnaissance and submarine observation, their locations plotted with sufficient accuracy to permit pre-planned artillery strikes. However, supporting 3 separate landing forces meant that the available battleships and cruisers had to divide their attention across multiple target areas, reducing the concentrated bombardment that had proven so effective in earlier operations. Fire support coordinators had to develop entirely new communication procedures to ensure that naval guns could respond rapidly to requests from 3 separate beachheads without creating dangerous conflicts between different target assignments. Air support presented even more complex challenges. Carrier-based aircraft had traditionally provided close air support by working with forward air controllers at a single landing site, developing situational awareness that allowed pilots to distinguish between friendly and enemy forces in the chaos of beach warfare. Supporting 3 simultaneous landings required aircraft to rapidly transition between different combat areas, each with its own tactical situation, friendly force positions, and immediate support requirements. Pilots had to master new radio procedures, navigation techniques, and target identification systems that allowed them to provide effective support across multiple separated battlefields. The landing craft allocation problem required American logistics to fundamentally reconsider how amphibious resources were distributed. Previous operations had used every available landing craft to deliver maximum force at the decisive point, accepting the risk of extended exposure to Japanese defensive fire in exchange for overwhelming local superiority. The 3-beach concept required holding back sufficient reserves to reinforce whichever landing encountered the strongest resistance, while ensuring that each initial assault had enough strength to establish a viable beachhead against unknown defensive arrangements. Most critically, the entire concept depended on maintaining absolute operational security until the moment of assault. If Japanese intelligence detected American preparations for multi-beach operations, Colonel Ishida and commanders like him would have time to redeploy their defensive forces, negating the fundamental advantage of tactical surprise. This requirement meant that even American unit commanders were kept unaware of the full operational plan until the final briefings, creating enormous coordination challenges while preserving the secrecy essential to success. Captain Chen's analysis had identified Kume-jima as the perfect target for testing these revolutionary tactical concepts. The island's 3 potential landing beaches were separated by terrain features that would prevent rapid movement of Japanese defensive forces between different sectors. Aerial reconnaissance had confirmed that Colonel Ishida had concentrated his strongest defenses at Shirahama Beach, exactly as Chen's theoretical framework predicted. Most importantly, radio intercepts suggested that the Japanese garrison remained completely unaware that American planners had even considered multi-beach assault options. The American task force approaching Kume-jima on March 17th consisted of units specifically organized and trained for simultaneous operations. Rather than the traditional structure of a single reinforced division supported by specialized units, Task Force 61 comprised 3 separate assault groups, each capable of independent operations but coordinated through an integrated command structure that could respond rapidly to changing tactical situations. The 3rd Marine Division provided the Shirahama Assault Force, while the 7th Infantry Division split between Kuronami and Minamihama landings, with extensive cross-training ensuring that all units understood how their individual missions contributed to the overall operational concept. Training for these operations had required developing entirely new tactical procedures. Marine and Army units had practiced amphibious assaults at multiple California beaches simultaneously, learning to coordinate their operations while maintaining independent capability to respond to local tactical challenges. Landing craft crews had rehearsed complex coordination procedures that allowed them to support multiple beaches without creating dangerous congestion in offshore areas. Most importantly, communication specialists had developed radio procedures that allowed the overall task force commander to maintain situational awareness across 3 separate battles while providing tactical flexibility to subordinate commanders facing immediate combat decisions. The naval component of Task Force 61 reflected these tactical innovations in its organization and equipment. Rather than concentrating all available firepower to support a single landing, the fleet was organized into 3 mutually supporting groups, each capable of providing comprehensive fire support to its assigned beach while maintaining sufficient flexibility to reinforce other landings if tactical circumstances required. The battleship Pennsylvania led the Shirahama support group, while the cruisers Louisville and Portland provided fire support for the Kuronami and Minamihama operations respectively. Destroyer screens for each group had been carefully positioned to provide both anti-submarine protection and additional fire support without creating coordination conflicts between different naval units. Intelligence preparation for the Kume-jima operation had been more thorough than any previous Pacific amphibious assault. Chen's intelligence team had created detailed models of Japanese defensive positions, studied the personal backgrounds and tactical preferences of known garrison commanders, and even analyzed the psychological profiles of individual units to predict how they might respond to unexpected tactical situations. This intelligence picture had been distributed down to company-level commanders, ensuring that even junior officers understood not only their own missions, but how Japanese defensive reactions might create opportunities for tactical exploitation. The deception plan accompanying these preparations had been equally sophisticated. The obvious concentration of American naval forces off Shirahama Beach was entirely genuine, designed to reinforce Japanese expectations while concealing the true scope of American intentions. Colonel Ishida and his observers were seeing exactly what they expected to see, a traditional American amphibious assault preparation focused on overwhelming the strongest Japanese defensive position. The secondary assault forces approaching Kuronami and Minamihama beaches remained concealed beyond the horizon, their approach timed to achieve simultaneous landings despite the different distances and navigational challenges involved. Radio deception had been particularly crucial to maintaining operational security. American communication specialists had been broadcasting false radio traffic suggesting that only a single reinforced regiment was approaching Kume-jima, while the actual assault force consisted of nearly 2 full divisions. Japanese radio intercept capabilities, though limited by equipment shortages and personnel losses, remained sufficiently sophisticated to detect major changes in American communication patterns. The deception plan required maintaining normal radio procedures while concealing the additional communication networks necessary to coordinate 3 simultaneous operations. Weather conditions on March 17th had presented additional challenges that American planners had been forced to incorporate into their tactical timeline. Pacific spring weather patterns created morning fog conditions that would provide natural concealment for the secondary assault forces. But the same conditions would complicate naval gunfire support and air operations during the critical initial landing phases. American meteorologists had calculated precise timing windows that balanced the advantage of concealment against the disadvantages of reduced visibility for supporting fires. As the morning fog began to dissipate around 700 hours, American landing craft began their final approach to 3 separate beaches on Kume-jima. Lieutenant Commander Yamada, still focused entirely on the obvious threat approaching Shirahama Beach, had no indication that 2 additional assault forces were simultaneously approaching objectives his garrison had dismissed as secondary concerns. The radio networks connecting Japanese defensive positions carried routine reports of the expected American assault preparation, with no hint that Colonel Ishida's carefully prepared defensive plan was about to encounter a tactical challenge for which no Japanese commander in the Pacific had prepared. The moment of tactical surprise was now only minutes away. American landing craft approached 3 beaches simultaneously, their crews executing coordination procedures that had never been attempted in combat, their assault troops prepared to execute missions based on intelligence analysis that had identified a critical vulnerability in Japanese defensive thinking. The question now was whether American tactical innovation could overcome Japanese defensive preparation, whether simultaneous assault could achieve what traditional concentration of force had accomplished through overwhelming firepower, and whether the garrison of Kume-jima would be able to adapt quickly enough to coordinate effective resistance against attacks coming from 3 directions at once. The revolutionary nature of this tactical experiment would soon be tested against one of the most thoroughly prepared Japanese defensive positions in the Pacific, with consequences that would influence amphibious warfare doctrine for decades to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.